So I welcome everybody who's here in the room at Alberta Health and also people who are able to participate online, and welcome to part of the Network of Alberta Health Economics speaker series. And today I'm John Sproul with the Institute of Health Economics, and really pleased to be able to support these kind of ongoing things with the support of Alberta Health. And today we're going to be having a presentation from Dr. Scott Clarenbach on the real-world evidence and the real-world evidence consortium, which Scott co-chairs along with Dr. Fiona Clement, I believe, from the University of Calgary. And you'll learn more about what that is from him. And Scott's a unique individual because he's a clinician, a specialist nephrologist, and he also has had advanced health economics training. So he wears many hats. I think Scott will be having interactive discussion through his presentation. Hopefully people will be able to hear online. We're not going to be able to have questions from those online, but only from those in the room, but hopefully everybody will be participate. So I'll just, please join me in welcoming Dr. Scott Clarenbach.
Great, thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me to be here. This is one of the first events that I've been at with this group, so some of it is a little bit informal, and I'm hoping to get a bit of feedback and interaction. I always find it really valuable. So I see the purpose of these talks many times, you know, when we're in academia or at the university, there's divisions or a lack of communication. We see that between the clinicians and the researchers, but there's also sometimes a division between research and the policymakers and you folks at Alberta Health. So getting your perspective and your input on these things, I find to be really valuable. So I'm going to give an overview of this, and maybe before I start, I'll give a little bit more background on myself, and then if we could just kind of quickly go around the room just to see what areas people are from Alberta Health, and maybe what your interests are, like why you're here and why this is important to you. So as mentioned, I'm a clinician, and when I went through my training, that's all I thought I would be is a clinician. I did some additional training when it was told me by a preceptor that the cost of dialysis was extremely high and we had exponential growth. And then unless we as a clinical group took responsibility for this huge amount of resource utilization, it's going to be dictated to us. So I went to the UK, got a master's, and then from that did a lot of academic work, but that's also allowed me the privilege of trying to implement research into policy. So I've done some work with CADIF, with some optimal use programs, and I'm involved with the Kidney Health Strategic Clinical Network, where again we try to bring all those different groups together from operations, clinicians, patients, to inform best practices. And then I also am the chair of the expert committee on drugs and therapeutics. So we, a group of us, including Fiona Clement, who was mentioned earlier, she's the other co-chair from Calgary, look at the evidence and make recommendations to Blue Cross about what should be on the formulary. So kind of have it's been a nice experience to kind of see that whole breadth of it and how the rubber hits the road with respect to policy. And I think a lot of that speaks with real-world evidence and how we can use that to inform optimal use of medications and technologies and processes of care, but as well as efficiencies and policies. So maybe we go around quickly the room, just kind of general area and what you're interested is in real-world evidence.
I work with the expert committee process and that, so obviously interested in this topic.
Len Frank, also with Alberta Blue Cross, and I work with Dave.
Helene Tamusiak, Primary Care Network in Clinical Services.
Bart Johnson, Executive Director with the Research and Innovation Branch at Alberta Health, and we're directly involved in the RWE consortium.
Hi, I'm Nigor. I'm a health economist and data analyst at the Institute of Health Economics, seconded to Alberta Health to work on some SUDA projects, secondary use data access projects.
Yep. So I'm Jeff Rounds. I'm lead for health economics at the IAG.
Ken Morrison, I'm in Alberta Health in data access and customer relations.
Cindy Fung, Health Economics, Alberta Health.
Fatima Al-Saya, I'm a health outcomes researcher at the U of A.
And Chad Mitchell, I'm the Executive Director for the Drugs and Health Benefit Program here at Alberta Health.
Hi, I'm Camille Baylor. I'm the Executive Director for Provider Compensation Strategic Partnerships here at Health.
Bruce McDonald, Surveillance Analyst with the Epi and Surveillance branch in Alberta Health.
Ellen Rafferty, I'm a postdoctoral fellow at U of A, kind of working at Alberta Health in the analytics and reporting branch.
Matt Parker. I'm from Alta ML, which is a machine learning or AI startup, and I'm of course interested in sector use data.
Sandra Reese, Pharmaceutical Policy Consultant at Alberta Health.
Kate Wagenthal, Policy Advisor with Research and Innovation, Alberta Health.
Judy Ball, Director of Strategic Partnerships at the University Hospital Foundation, and many of our partners are doing several projects in the real-world evidence space.
Dan Labby, Patient Access Manager for Beringer Ingelheim, Alberta, Saskatchewan.
I'm Bonnie Feigen, I'm an Intellectual Property Advisor with the Canadian Intellectual Property Office, and I track developments in health and science center in Alberta.
Elizabeth Dufresne at Alberta Health, and we're in performance reporting branch, and I manage data access.
And Brent Cordy, I support the Alberta RWE Consortium from a business development, so I work directly with the companies that are interested in doing real-world evidence projects in Alberta and support the consortium in that way. I'm also a health policy consultant with Global Public Affairs.
Keith Gilchrist with Janssen Pharmaceuticals. We're involved in a partnership with the government of Alberta and the University Hospital Foundation as a real world evidence component.
Great. So a lot of what I'll be talking about is probably repetition to many of you who use real world evidence all the time. And for those of you in the back, there are some chairs up front if you don't want to stand. So I'm going to kind of go through an interview in context. I'll go through some definitions. I'll talk about what the current use of RWE is, and then maybe spend a little bit more time about talking about what its potential use might be and why in its exciting development and why we should be paying attention to it. Industry, academia, decision, and policymaker. And then I'll end off with talking about why Alberta is perhaps one of the best places where we can use real world data to generate real world evidence that improves health outcomes and our healthcare system. So this was the context slide where I was going to ask everyone the questions. We've already done that. So just to get some definitions, the data is obvious. It's the things that we collect on a routine basis. And this can be either the administrative data that many of you folks are involved with. It can be routinely captured as part of quality improvement initiatives. Many clinical programs are interested in capturing patient-reported outcome measures, quality of life measures, symptom burden, and those are housed in databases. And then this could be augmented by various different registries, research databases. And now more emerging with that will be the Institute of more electronic health records, which might provide more granular data, as well as some other, these are smaller projects right now, but you might have heard in the US where, for example, healthcare organizations are considering providing fitness trackers or other sort of sensors to patients or to the people that are under their healthcare insurance plan to again kind of get different sort of data, some biometric data and biosensor data. Real world evidence is when we use that clinical evidence on benefits or risks of a medical intervention and process. And I'm going to go through a little bit and I'm going to focus on drugs, although because drugs it's a little bit easier to understand. There's a well-defined process, but it doesn't just apply to drugs. This can apply to technologies, can apply to processes of care. But there's a few specific issues around drug approval and funding. And I apologize if I'm going through stuff that many of you already know, but I think it's important just to get an idea of where we stand now so you get a better understanding of what might be the future of how we use real-world evidence. So you're probably aware of all these steps. First, you have to get a drug approved, and that's using the Health Canada process. And Health Canada primarily looks at evidence of does it work, and is it safe to use? The evidence for effectiveness or efficacy is largely based on randomized control trials. And they have an evidentiary bar. They kind of review it and say, yeah, this provides benefit, and it looks like it's safe to use, so it's approved by Health Canada. But there's a separate or subsequent steps for drugs in Canada, because not just with the approval side of things, but with reimbursement. So just because a drug is approved by Health Canada doesn't necessarily mean that it is of value to Canadians. That is, maybe there's some questions about how effective it is with respect to clinically important outcomes. But more importantly, perhaps if it's cost effective, that is, provides reasonable value for taxpayers in the publicly funded healthcare plans. So that's where the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology in Health comes in, where there's this formal review process where they look at all the evidence with respect to if a drug works, the side effect profile, and if it's worth it. But then even then, there's a subsequent step. So after CADTH has gone, and I'm not sure if any of you have taken a look at some of the CADTH reports. Anyone seen them? So there's hundreds of pages that go through both the clinical review as well as the economic review. And these get distilled down to a summary, which then gets distilled down into perhaps like a one-pager on list or do not list. And if it's list, it's perhaps with a few caveats that should only be used in this population, or there should be a price reduction. And then that's used by the provinces, and kind of more specifically, the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance. Sorry, I put association there, but it's alliance, which is a kind of our step towards having negotiation with drug companies on a national level. So instead of individual provinces coming up with negotiations, perhaps there being different prices across Canada, they negotiate en masse. And then a province can decide if they want to opt in or opt out. So several steps that go throughout this process. And as I mentioned before, a lot of drug approval is based on fairly expensive, large clinical trials. So I think it's important to recognize that these clinical trials are used to demonstrate efficacy. And efficacy means, do they work in a kind of a very controlled situation? So it's often distinctly different from what occurs in clinical practice. So for example, you're a patient with severe asthma that you see in the clinic who you might be thinking, well, maybe they might benefit from one of the newer biologics to treat their asthma. A lot of times those patients may not be represented in clinical trials. And we say it in nephrology all the time, so we have patients with some degree of kidney impairment, but that's often an exclusion criteria. So for example, a lot of the anticoagulants that are used, we don't know if we should be using them in our patient population because they haven't been studied. So efficacy, so that is in a very controlled environment, versus effectiveness. Effectiveness would mean how does it work in the real world setting? And it's a restricted and very controlled. And I still think this is an appropriate approach to determine the efficacy of a study or of a drug or an intervention, but it misses out on a whole lot of other useful information that patients, clinicians, and decision makers might find important. The other issue is that this is a kind of you could see it as a binary process. So they submit to Health Canada, does it get approved, yes or no? Or you submit it to CADTH for their drug, through their drug review process, and they make a decision, list, yes or no. And there's all these other considerations that, well, there might be a lot of uncertainty about whether that drug works as well as we think it does in the real world setting. Maybe it works, maybe there's other populations who might benefit from it that weren't studied. But because it's a one-time process, you either get over that hurdle or you don't. And you can see this from both sides. Some people would argue that that hurdle is too high, and we are not allowing beneficial medications to be used in patients because that hurdle is set too high, and there's these regulatory or other requirements that mean that that patients who might benefit from these medications can't get access to them. The flip side is that many people might say that barrier is too low. An example might be if a clinical trial shows benefit, but it's on a surrogate outcome, or the trial is short, but you'd use it in a long-term condition. Or back to the example I gave before, that it works in a very controlled situation, but we don't know if it works in the real world. So for example, going back to the patients with asthma, if I talk to my respirologist colleagues, they would say, yeah, if you have someone with really severe asthma, you have to kind of go through this whole list of things to make sure you get their asthma under control. And that would include non-pharmacologic. So are you making sure their environment is completely clear of the antigen or whatever triggers their asthma? Are they compliant with all these other steps of the medication? And then if you've done that, then maybe you would consider treating this person with this newer agent. But, and this is the argument from the respirologist at the U of A in a specialty clinic, they'd say, well, they're worried that these drugs are used in patients who maybe don't go through that criteria. So it could be an expanded patient population who may or may not benefit as much from the drug as those that were studied in the trial. So if that bar is set too low, we might be having really expensive medications that maybe don't work as well as they do in a clinical trial setting. And then finally, there's this issue of risk sharing. Because there's oftentimes uncertainty about how well a drug works or uncertainty in how cost-effective that drug is, there's some element of risk. So a payer might decide to say, well, okay, it looks reasonable and we'll fund the drug, but there's these 3 or 4 issues that we're concerned about. We might be concerned about what the patient population is being used in, or if it's being used appropriately, such as used appropriately in the sequence of therapies. Again, biologics are a good example. They're an expensive medication, and they're really useful for some patients, but they're not first-line therapies, and patients should go through the appropriate steps before they move to the more expensive medications. And there's no risk sharing. So if you, at this point in time, if there's uncertainty on whether a drug works or it's cost-effective, there really isn't a robust process by which to reevaluate those outcomes. So after either you decide that you're going to fund the drug and use it, or you decide you're not going to, but there's no provisional recommendations. There's no, well, let's provide the drug, but then capture these specific outcomes to determine how it fits in with therapy. And maybe it works and that's great, or maybe it's being used inappropriately or works differently in the real world setting than it does in the trials. So right now, real world evidence is used all the time. And in fact, I'm sometimes a little bit embarrassed about the term of real world evidence, because it's the stuff that many of you in the room have been working with for decades. It's just routinely captured observational data with all the inherent biases and problems with it. But don't worry, I won't trash it completely, because I do think it's important. We've been using these for a long time to inform these clinical trials. So you can use observational type studies to generate hypotheses. You can use them to inform the prior and Bayesian model. So what percentage of patients develop a complication due to a certain disorder. This is often helpful for industry to figure, well, what is the market for a potential new strategy or a new drug? And what are the care gaps? So for example, if you have a new drug and it controls diabetes, and what it really does is it prevents hypoglycemia, then you could say, well, let's take a look and see how common is hypoglycemia in the different patient populations, and so what groups of patients are more likely to benefit from it. And then it's been used for quite a while for surveillance of drug safety, so post-marketing surveillance. And it's also been used to capture health outcomes, resource utilization, to determine uptake, diffusion, implementation of new drugs or technologies, monitor and inform evidence-based clinical and policy decision-making. But a lot of that really isn't linked into drug reimbursement or policy. I see some real movement forward with the advent of the strategic clinical networks, where we're bringing folks together who are both on the operations side, on the clinical side, as well as the research side, to use this information to inform best practices and best how we take best care of our patients. So, for example, in nephrology, we have two different ways to treat people with kidney failure. We're using dialysis. So there's kidney transplantation, which is the best strategy. Many patients require dialysis, and there's two different forms. One is where they come into the hospital and they're hooked up to a machine through a needle, takes their blood out, cleans it through the machine, and puts it back in their body. And the other option is peritoneal dialysis, where they have a tube put in their belly, they put fluid in, it sits there for a while, then they exchange it, and that gets rid of the toxins. That one can be done at home, whereas the hemodialysis has to be done in a hospital setting. There was a recent health technology assessment that was done through CADITH, and a couple of us from Alberta were involved in it. And what it showed is that of those two types of dialysis therapies, there really was no evidence that there was a difference with respect to clinical outcomes as well as harms, but there was a big difference in cost. So what this led to is our clinical network saying, well, maybe we should try to be promoting the less costly form of dialysis. There's some other kind of softer benefits as well. You might promote patient independence because they're doing it at home. Those patients are better able to travel, and it frees up resources so we can provide care in other areas where patients might benefit. So again, we set up a surveillance system where we captured the patient flow through all the different steps of how they end up on dialysis, and found out where we weren't doing such a good job of either educating patients or helping them make an informed decision to choose the home-based modality. And then using that with our operations and clinical partners have shifted the needle. So instead of only 20% of our patients being on peritoneal dialysis, that's now up to 30 or 35%. So that's an example where we've used real-world evidence in several different ways. One is through the use of the health technology assessment, which used this evidence both on outcomes as well as on healthcare costs associated with dialysis. And then generated our own evidence using kind of a standardized process to capture it, to figure out where we're not doing a good job and to try to fix those. I've talked about some of these as well, how real-world evidence is used, informed gaps in care, hypoglycemia, how well patients adhere to optimal therapy. That's something else that SCNs as well as policymakers are interested in. So before you move to the most expensive oral agent to prevent your diabetes, the recommendations are, and the evidence demonstrates, that you should be on metformin first. Great clinical outcomes, but less costly before you move on to the others. Okay, so a lot of what I mentioned is kind of old news. These are things that we've already been doing with the data. So what's new and what are the potential opportunities? And this is looking forward to the future. So if you have any questions or input on this, I think it's now's a chance to speak up, and I'd like to hear your input. So one is on the regulatory side, and I'll tell you what the FDA is doing. FDA is taking a close look at, instead of relying on randomized, efficacy-based controlled trials, to look at drug effectiveness using real-world evidence. So why are they looking at that? Well, they feel that there might be a missed opportunity. So again, once a drug is available and in use, there might be opportunities to use real-world evidence to expand the indication, to reconsider the dose or the regimen, to perhaps expand the population of the indication on which it's being used, and also to potentially consider comparative effectiveness. Again, there's all these emerging data sets that make it more and more feasible to consider this type of information and evidence gathering because of patient-reported outcomes, electronic health records, and other information sources such as biosensors and wearables. And why are they considering this? Well, again, there's that issue of the hurdle. So FDA's approach is, or one of their approaches is to ensure that we have a timely, or that patients have timely access to medications. So if there's uncertainty about how a medication actually functions in a specific population, they won't just say no, they will say no, but we will be willing to relook at it once there's real world evidence available to inform it. It also might overcome some limitations. So we can all think of interventions in cardiovascular disease where it's really not that difficult to get a 10,000 person randomized controlled trial, give the intervention to half and not to the other, and then look at survival or cardiac events and figure out, yeah, this intervention works or it doesn't. That gets much, much harder to do in rare diseases or where there's ethical issues that make doing an RCT hard to do. There's some rare diseases that last a long time period as well. So the progression of that disease might be years. So in order to really do a rigorous study that looks at clinically important outcomes, it might take decades or even longer to recruit enough patients and then follow them for enough time to figure out if things work or not. So it's not just in the US, but Health Canada is also interested in looking at real-world evidence. Again, they have a commitment to improve affordability, accessibility, and appropriate use. So again, on the one side, is that barrier too high? And perhaps we could try to lower that barrier in a safe and reasonable way using real-world evidence. So they want to look at how we use real-world evidence in drugs and devices, look at them throughout their life cycle. Again, consider safety and effectiveness, and also consider replacement of real-world evidence-based studies where traditionally these use randomized controlled trials. Again, this is to ensure or to try to promote timely access to effective medications. But it does require, there's some caveats with respect to how actually we're going to operationalize this. We need timely access to data. We need to make sure it's high quality. I just put this in here because, sorry, go ahead.
Scott, I just thought I would, just out of interest on the regulatory, just because it just came out in the last short while, and Alberta, the IHE was involved with Health Canada and with CADIT around the use of real-world evidence in regulatory decision-making, and there was a national workshop which has just gotten posted in French and English on the IHE website. I mean, if people are interested in the area, it kind of summarizes some directions where Health Canada and CADIT and industry came together to kind of, and a number of people to talk about, well, what meets decision-grade real-world evidence that might be part of a submission for evidence for regulatory purposes. And it's being talked around the world. We need more than RCT, but you don't want an editorial from a newspaper or whatever, or some kind of what might be the characteristics of decision-grade real-world evidence? And it just noted to the data and evidence quality point that you made there. But it was just a reference that was Alberta had a connection in for interest.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And I'll talk a little bit about data quality a little later and how that fits in. And my understanding is that, in these discussions, it's not that Health Canada is considering it or they don't really want to do a pilot project. They don't want to call it a pilot. They are kind of on this path, and they want to use real-world evidence. And again, not really demonstration, but they're moving this direction, and they're working on projects where they'll use real-world evidence to inform their decision making. Any other comments or questions on the Health Canada side? This is just to highlight a point that I think a lot of us know, that we're spending increasingly large amounts of our gross domestic product on healthcare. And while that might seem like a reasonable thing to do, I think we have to consider the opportunity costs of that. So if we spend more on health, that means we're spending less on other issues such as education, infrastructure, environmental issues. So it's important for us to, I think, as a whole, for the healthcare system to make appropriately informed decisions and use our finite resources carefully. The bottom line is that even for affluent countries like Canada, is we cannot afford all beneficial new drugs and new therapeutics. So you have to make sometimes the difficult decisions about what we are going to fund and what we're not going to. And again, that's what the whole process around reimbursement is to ensure that we're getting reasonable value for the finite amount of healthcare dollars that we're spending. So CADTH and the Common Drug Review have been involved in looking at effectiveness and cost effectiveness in their decision-making process. And as I mentioned before, at this point in time, it's largely a uniphasic process. So they will evaluate the evidence for a drug at a certain period of time and come up with a recommendation regarding how that drug should fit in to formularies and funding. But they recognize that while that was a great step, and actually I think has led to some uniformity across Canada in terms of how drugs are reimbursed and how we look at evidence, doing it in a uniphasic approach is missing out on a lot of opportunities. And CADTH again has stated that they are very interested in broadening that. So instead of looking at one point in time, we're going to make a decision. Do you make it over that hurdle or not? More involved and putting more attention and focus on looking at the life cycle of a drug and technology. So right at the beginning, does it meet that hurdle for being reimbursed and should it be used? To kind of the next steps, the early implementation, is it being used optimally in the best sequence of care? And perhaps there's uncertainty in that initial phase when a drug or technology is first used, that where more data will be required to figure out where its most appropriate role is. And if the signals in that early phase really follow through in subsequent phases. So right now, if a drug gets on a formulary or a device gets implemented, there's no formal process to say, well, wait a minute, we're uncertain about how it's being used. We're uncertain about its real-world effectiveness. And we want a mechanism by which to capture these outcomes, which then might be linked back to how that drug is used. And it can go all the way from we're now no longer going to provide this intervention because it doesn't work to maybe expanding the criteria or the patient population in which it's used because the evidence suggests that it works as well in people with chronic kidney disease as it does in the study population. But that leads to a lot of questions and a lot of process-based questions as well. So number one is you have to come up with a clear idea of what real-world evidence or what outcomes you want to capture. You have to have a clear idea of how you're going to get that information. So who's capturing that information? What is the data sources? So what's the data that's being used? What's the quality of that data source? And what sort of analytic plan is being used to assess it? And then finally, you probably even need a more stricter criteria to, like, once you get that information, having a clear idea of how you're going to act on it. So for example, going back to the asthma biologics, in the randomized controlled trials in patients that they used, it reduced hospitalizations and emergency room use by, I think, around 25%, which is great. Patients are better, saves the healthcare system money because you're not having patients in the emergency room and in the hospitals. But if you said, well, we were uncertain because that was a very narrow population, and we don't really know if it works as well in the real world as it does in the trials as it does in the real world. So perhaps you can imagine just the hypothetical scenario, say, okay, well, we're going to provisionally provide this drug, but we want to capture outcomes on hospitalization rates. So you need to determine how you're going to get that data. This is an example that's pretty straightforward. That information is routinely captured on all residents of Alberta. And then you'd have to look at, well, what's your control group? Are we using a pre and post control group? And if so, is that appropriate? Using observational data has confounders. So perhaps the the pre-group maybe they were in a different environment or under different conditions. Maybe they weren't optimally controlled. They saw a respirologist who put them on 3 drugs, and one of them is a biologic, and maybe they improved dramatically, but it's not due to the drug, or it's not due to the biologic, it's due to other issues. Or maybe they're no longer receiving or being exposed to the antigen. So you have to kind of get that methodologic framework in place as well, and everyone agree on it. And then when you, at a year or 2 years down the line, if you're saying, well, I'm going to use this to inform reimbursement, I think it'd be easy if you said, oh yeah, we're seeing in the real world exactly what we saw in the clinical trials. The patients that are using this drug, they have less hospitalizations. That's a check mark. But what if the hospitalization rate is 15% lower or 10% lower? What does that mean? And having a clear idea of what sort of outcome you want to get and how that will influence that second step. So if it's an interim or provisional funding, or how exactly will that data change that next step, probably needs to be hammered out. So there's a lot of, so I think this is an important direction to move in. Oftentimes we provide a drug and technology and then we don't really pay attention to it anymore. And that's even a problem even from a clinical perspective. We have some really useful medications that are very cost effective that aren't being used in the patient population who they're indicated. So even knowing that sort of information can really help improve the health and healthcare system sustainability. But we do very little work in this area. It's only a few academics, or if a strategic clinical network, they say it's at the top of our priority, will they work on it. But having a mechanism by which that this is routine, so yeah, we're not just going to decide to look at the evidence and fund a drug or not fund the drug, but then follow it through its life cycle to make sure we're using it as appropriately as possible, including when maybe there's new drugs in place and that drug has reached the end of its life cycle, maybe it should be removed from the formulary and not used anymore. We have a big problem at Blue Cross, and I'm not sure if we should be bringing up all the dirty laundry, but we're so busy looking at all these new expensive drugs that manufacturers want to get on the formulary, spend a lot of time on that we have very little time and there's very little scrutiny on the drugs that are there, have been there for a year or 2 years or 5 years. And there's probably a lot of efficiencies and health benefits to be gained by saying, you know, this drug was restricted access because we were worried about its cost, but now it's generic and there's a lot of people who actually benefit from this drug. We should maybe rethink about how we're using it and make sure that people who need the drug can get it. So I think this is an important area, and this is where real world evidence really begins to shine. We capture a lot of it, and it directly informs or it directly tells us what's happening in Alberta. So I talked about some of these issues about how we mandate compliance, how we develop or generate real world evidence, where the funding and responsibility comes in, and how this evidence should be used within a reassessment framework. So there's a lot of question marks, but it appears that there's also a lot of enthusiasm to go down this route. I'll mention briefly there's a CIHR-funded proposal so looking at the real-world evidence of value for cancer drugs. And they're kind of doing something that's similar to a lot of what I talked about. They want to improve resource allocation and system sustainability. So they're going back and they're looking at all the recommendations for funding of the cancer drugs. And then they're revisiting these recommendations by identifying those drugs in which real-world evidence exists, and then trying to compare, well, what was the evidence when the drug was funded, and then what does the real-world evidence tell us? And then how can that real-world evidence be used to maybe modify or inform so we can make better decisions and better use of these drugs? And that might include, making drugs that really work more available, or if it looks like drugs aren't working, maybe those should be delisted or taken off the formulary, not made available. And then, of course, there's the whole issues around industry, and I've touched on this already, how real-world evidence can be really important for identifying population, unmet need, research planning, validating surrogates, and then also can help to again, feeding back into that Health Canada and FDA evidentiary requirement, is yet you might have an accelerated regulatory action so you can get drugs that look like they might work out to the public sooner while doing it in a safe way because you're capturing outcomes. So safety, expanded indication, and then optimizing reimbursement are important for the industry folks. So I've talked a lot, and it's been pretty high level and pretty broad. I'm hoping I'm communicating to you that there's a lot of opportunity for real world evidence. So the regulatory reimbursement side, how we provide optimal care for patients, so drugs, technologies, processes of care that are important for the strategic clinical networks. It can be used for observational, quasi-experimental, and pragmatic RCTs. And there's all these groups, Health Canada, CADIF, health authorities, that are increasingly turning to the evidence that we have readily available to make better decisions. So we're kind of at this tipping point where, we've been using this type of data for a long time. There's now interest and efforts to use real-world evidence to really push both regulatory reimbursement decisions as well as try to optimize care. So there's a real opportunity here. And that's where the Real World Evidence Consortium comes in. And I'll kind of give a brief overview of that. Really, what we recognize in Alberta is, many of us, we're Canadian and we're Albertan, we're in some ways humble, but we have a fantastic world-class opportunity and resource in Alberta, and that is the organization and funding of our healthcare system and the data systems that we already have in place, augmented by additional data that researchers are using, clinicians are using, and that might be emerging with the electronic health record, such as Connect Care. So we have a single health authority, fully integrated. We have the strategic clinical networks as well, and then advanced health information system and databases. And if you kind of look at what is being published from an academic perspective, many of these publications that use Alberta data are in the high-tier medical journals because they don't have the limitations that a lot of other data sets have. So we have so to distinguish us from the United States, for example, we have one payer and everyone is captured. So having a population-based data set is really quite valuable. Even the out-migration issue, which is fairly large in some US HMOs or insurance companies, can be as high as 20+% per year. So you're losing those people. Whereas in Alberta, we only have really out-migration, so people who move to another province, which tends to be less than 1% per year. So to have a population-based data set to observe what happens to people is really hugely valuable. In Alberta, which is different from some other provinces, we currently have all of our medication use in electronic format. Again, a huge advantage. And there's other groups that have linked other data sources together, such as using lab data or routinely captured data in the cardiac catheterization suites on outcomes that really bring this to the fore. So I'm not sure if how well you can see this. I'm sure some of you are familiar with some of the data sets, but maybe not all of them, particularly those that have been set up by researchers, but that can be used to conduct real-world evidence studies. The consortium is made up of 3 parties. So there's the Institute of Health Economics, which is the secretariat, but it's also tied in with the University of Alberta and the University of Calgary. And we also have other members, so Alberta Innovates, Alberta Health, Alberta Economic Development and Trade, and Alberta Health Services. And the reason why we brought these groups together is to try to take advantage of the assets that we have in Alberta. And there's several different ways we can grow this. So one is we can promote ourselves as this is the place to do real-world evidence. If the FDA or if Health Canada is interested in capturing outcomes, we have the capacity to do so, both with the data side, but also from a research expertise side. And we also have some folks that are, especially at the IHE, who are very interested in the policy side. So as we're figuring out how we're actually going to conduct this data and how we're going to, and the evidence, and how we're going to use it to inform policy, we kind of have that breadth and depth of folks that can contribute to implementation. So I'm not going to go into a lot of the details of the methodologies and the data, but just to kind of talk about what the goal is and what the function. So we want to ensure there's high quality projects. We want to there's that management issue so that we can adhere to the timelines and budgets and focus the projects for priority issues. We want to the consortium aims to optimize real world evidence studies, to enhance the ecosystem, which is why we have the 2 universities in the IHE, so that we have the whole entire province involved in strengthening the ecosystem, providing input on study design, execution, knowledge sharing, and to ensure that the projects align with the priorities, so both with provincial health, the payers, as well as from the clinical side, the strategic clinical networks, and conducting these large-scale projects that may have implementation elements to them. This is a couple slides from the U of A and the U of C. So this kind of gives an overview. Why I think it's really important that we have these broad linkages is, I think we can see the example from the strategic clinical networks is that the more stakeholders you have at the table, the more likely you are to be successful in your endeavor. Not with even just completing it, but actually implementation. So with the universities engaging academic resources and investigators to some of these projects can build capacity. And we're hoping that we might be doing a real world evidence that might be an industry sponsored study looking at care gaps in a specific condition, but our ability to conduct that might open opportunities for academic researchers. So if we've worked on the methodologies, if we've amalgamated different data sources to answer that question, then that's an opportunity for other investigators to further interrogate that real world evidence to answer other questions that are important to academics or to healthcare policymakers or decision makers. A couple examples, there's Approach. Have any of you guys heard of Approach? Some people have. This is just an example where we've kind of, at the backbone is the routinely captured administrative data. So outpatient, inpatient, drug use, demographics. And then it's been a separate database, which was initially a research database called Approach, had augmented this with additional information from the cardiac cath lab. So it allows on patients who are assessed by the cardiologist and undergo cardiac catheterization, there's really detailed information on the characteristics of those patients. So for example, what their ejection fraction is, what their blockage in the arteries are, what their kidney function is. That can allow really in-depth studies. You can ask questions that you couldn't answer from other databases. The interdisciplinary chronic disease collaboration, I'll mention that I work with colleagues in Calgary with this as well. And again, there's ongoing data, prospective data capture, as well as linked with lab data. It really is a world-class database. And in fact, some of my colleagues and I been used to inform guidelines in nephrology because it's one of the few population-based data sets that allows you to characterize kidney function and outcomes. And that's pretty basic, but then it allows you to, there's many other projects that we're working on. So for example, with the newer anticoagulation medications, where we don't know what the safety profile is in patients with chronic kidney disease, we can look at our real world data. We can see who's prescribed these medications. So number one, are they being prescribed appropriately? And then number two, in those, when they are prescribed in that gray zone population that haven't been studied in the clinical trials, we can determine, well, what are their event rates like? Are they getting excess rates of bleeding compared to standard of care? Are they getting excess rates of stroke or lower rates of stroke compared to standard of care? So all these questions that would take another 5-year very expensive randomized control trial, you can start to interrogate those using the data that we already have in hand. So in summary, hopefully I haven't bored you too much. I think you guys are all aware that we use real-world evidence and observational data all the time in our regular, kind of what we do on a regular basis. But there's an emerging role with real-world evidence and how it's going to be used in the regulatory reimbursement space, as well as informing optimal care. And Alberta is uniquely poised to take advantage of our assets here, not just the data assets, but the people assets and the enthusiasm for promoting this, that to make Alberta kind of a world-recognized place to do real-world evidence studies. So I'll stop here, and happy to have any discussion and take any questions that you might have.
I'll just start with one, as people might think about particular questions. But just a note to people who are in the room, Scott and the U of A and U of C, and certainly Scott and Fiona have been great leaders on this. There is a website for the Alberta RWE Consortium if you want to go and look at it. It's just early stages now of the planning, but I think it'll kind of be a bit, hopefully be a bit of a communication portal for some of the specific things. The other just comment is, I think Alberta, over the last number of years with leadership from the province and stuff, has gotten a lot better in terms of data access for researchers, because that's always been a perennial problem in terms of timeliness to data access. And so I didn't know, Scott, if you had any comments about that for a lot of studies, you know, yeah, we'll get you to that, or it comes out annually, or it comes out, you can get it 2 years from now, reports from 2012. And I think a significant advantage from Alberta in terms of the comprehensiveness and linkage of data is our ability to have timeliness in terms of kind of data that you can observe as a researcher.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, timeliness is important to adhering to timelines, but also important for quality of care. So there's this whole realm of the logistics, so it's hard to do studies if you can't get access to the data, and the SPORE data platform has really been revolutionary, or like has had a big element in making sure that data is available, and not just to researchers, but I see it in our strategic clinical networks. So we want to try to do surveillance on what's happening in our patient population for quality improvement and quality assurance, and knowing what our patients look like, what their outcomes are by using data and getting that in a timely fashion makes it, has made it a whole lot easier. So yeah, that's kind of a key fundamental element of this, is having access to data. And really, I kind of see there's opportunities to do more of this. Recently, there was a CMAG article, and they looked at data from CIHI, where they linked the DAT, the discharge to abstract database, to the tax files, and they looked at what how income changes with cardiovascular events. And some colleagues and I are interested in looking at that with kidney disease. But there's a real opportunity so we think about health a lot, but health is often influenced by socioeconomic factors. Alberta does have a lot of data, and I know there's been discussions about, you know, can we do even more novel things? So I think we have to focus on, we have the health data, timely access is important, and then think even more broadly, like, could we do more by accessing other data sets that are available in health, or kind of in the social security side also. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. You actually touched, I have two things I wanted to bring up. You touched on one of with your last comment there, and that's the things that influence health that are well outside the health system. Access to secure, affordable, high quality housing is a huge thing. The criminal justice system and stuff, and I was wondering how the RWE might try and link data across different government areas with that, if you had much thought on that. But you've sort of touched on it, so I don't know if you want to expand or if,
Yeah, so I won't speak on behalf of the consortium, I'll speak on behalf of me. And I wonder if I should censor my comments or not. I work in a tertiary or quaternary care hospital, and I deal with patients who are of lower socioeconomic status. And sometimes I wonder, we have this drug and technology that's to improve health, but would our patients be better served if we could address some of those issues that you mentioned? And we work in different silos, and often those silos don't talk to each other. And I totally agree. We'd like to do more. Some of the work that's been done has been using workarounds. So you use geographic information systems. So you can say, well, we know where this patient lives, and based on other types of data, we know what the income or education level of that neighborhood is. And so you can make inferences that way. I think it'd be a lot more robust if you could link it to other data sets like justice and such, but that's beyond my control. I certainly understand the concerns about that, but I think we might actually be able to do a better job of improving health and doing so in a wise way if we had more granular information. So how that will work from a RWE perspective or from Alberta Health or a government perspective remains to be seen, but I completely agree with your comment.
Yeah, thank you so much for this overview of the real evidence in the RWE. I guess my question is about kind of the patient engagement or consumer engagement piece. I guess I just thinking can see some opportunities and maybe some challenges there. Opportunities around, you could have buy-in from patients and consumers, but then maybe you'd also see some variability in outcomes between places. So that you get patients looking for the best care, you go to some surgeon or another hospital, and then also about consent about using this information for reimbursement and negotiations with your technology companies.
Right. Yeah. So there are a lot of hurdles. It's hard to know. So the patient voice is really important. We've seen more and more of that from the SCN perspective, where I think I mentioned it, but it's like the operations, the clinical, but they also have the patient perspective that comes in, and that's extremely valuable. How that works for drug reimbursement is another question. I think it's an important question and probably a broader question in this forum. I've had the opportunity to work on some CADTH work where it's not necessarily patients, but it's the public perspective that has been at the table, and that public perspective has been really quite valuable or important. I apologize. Some of the issues that you brought up are probably a whole talk in and of themselves. But you're right. So the ethical issues about can we use this data, and we're thinking very carefully about that as Connect Care is rolling out. There's been a lot of discussion about can we use that data for research, and a lot of folks are spending a lot of time and effort to ensure that it can be used for research. And in fact, what they've heard from at least the preliminary feedback from patients is, if you have that data on me and you're not using it to inform better decisions, then I'd be upset about that. But obviously all the protection issues, a lot of these have been sorted out, or there's rules around them from an Alberta Health perspective. I would expect that there'd be a similar sort of thing with the Connect Care side of it. And I didn't speak a lot about Connect Care because, it hasn't been implemented yet, but it adds a kind of a huge layer of granularity to data, and this is where the machine learning interest might come in. So I'm not an expert in machine learning. My understanding is that it works really well if you have a lot of detailed information on each individual, so a lot of depth. Right now in Alberta, we have a lot of breadth. So we have the entire population. We have the entire population, and we have some information on them. But if when the Connect Care, the electronic health record comes out, we will then have granular information on a lot of people, which is where we can start doing more work. I don't know if you have any other comments on that, but that's why I think while Alberta is I think a leader in terms of doing our real world evidence, when Connect Care is up and running, that's yet another step up in terms of opportunities.
Thanks, Scott. So you talk about the Alberta RWE advantage, there's the amount and quality of the data. You mentioned the people resources as well. I'd be interested in your assessment of what the people resources are in terms of capacity. How much can we, it sounds like there's so much can be done. How much can the province actually do?
Yeah, that's a great question. And even in my own little world, there's way more questions than there is time to answer them. So I'm not sure what the right answer is. If we can leverage and promote Alberta as being a leader and get people who are interested in doing studies and fund these studies, then we can grow that kind of baseline capacity. I think it's also up to the responsibility of the universities to ensure that, you know, we're not just have number crunchers, but we also have academics who can inform best methodological practices, but also to generate new research and new evidence that kind of builds upon this existing infrastructure. But I agree. I think it's going to take a lot of time and effort. And even within our own little unit at the U of A, I'm worried about capacity issues. And we're already thinking about, you know, if all this work actually comes our way, how are we going to deal with the volume and magnitude of it? And again, that might be go to the question of prioritization, which is again why I think it's important to have as many stakeholders as possible. So we're not just looking at a narrow perspective. We get all the stakeholders involved, and we can prioritize those projects so we can be as successful as possible.
And and then we'll probably just to close off, this will be the last question.
Just very briefly, it's a comment. From an industry perspective, real world evidence is our reality. We have to be able to demonstrate that value for money. But one thing that really limits our ability to do these types of PLAs, for example, is silo budgeting. Until that is effectively addressed, things like hospitalization, reduced ER visits, they just don't factor in. It's all about price. So until those silo budgets are overcome and the value is demonstrated and accepted, our hands are tied to a large degree as well.
And that's, yeah, I mean, silos are a big problem, not just for industry, but for all of us in healthcare. And that's where I'm a little bit encouraged. Again, I think we have a bit of an Alberta advantage with the strategic clinical networks, where we're bringing people together who used to function in their own silos and kind of interacted tangentially, but interdigitating them to, you know, to work towards a common goal. So hopefully with this type of work and with the stakeholder engagement, some of those issues can start to be assessed and sorted.
Thanks very much, everybody. And I do think actually the province and Alberta Health Services and people are trying to lay the platform for capacity building by ensuring that the SPORE people, the Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research, talk to people who are involved in other particular initiatives. The strategic clinical networks, I know, are a real advantage, say, compared to some other provinces where you can go and talk, at least the orthopedic specialists have gotten together, and you can ask a question of them and they can go and fight and bundle that discussion. Or now there is a new kidney strategic clinical network that has been launched, so at least you can have at least a voice for the particular clinical component, including patient things. And so I think some of those kind of shared platforms, so we don't have duplicate kind of platforms doing things, or at least be aware of other things. And a lot of that collaboration is starting to happen in the province. But please, I'm sure Scott will be around for a bit, but we'll close off the formal presentation. You can join me in thanking Scott for his presentation.